Hi. Um, Firstly, I'd like to give a shout out to these guys. Um, they're called Rev Reality, and they're headed up by a guy called Tommy Green, who's the lead singer of, or was the lead singer of a band called Sleeping Giant, and they do some amazing stuff, and they work within the alternative scene. If you want to check them out, go to revgatherings.com, or type in Rev Gatherings into Facebook, or have a look at Tommy Green's site. They people that we do some stuff with, and it's they're a good bunch of people. They've got a base up in Birmingham in this country, and Bristol. Used to have a base in Swindon, but Tommy comes over from time to time, and he always comes down to see us. So he's a really interesting guy, an interesting speaker, and you'd do well to check him out. The thing that I want to begin with now is basically the beginning of the Bible, and the beginning of the world. I'm gonna try and run through stories starting from Genesis and working my way through the Bible, however long this goes, roughly every 3 days. They should be about 15-20 minutes long, and some will be shorter, some will be longer, but we're going to start with the beginnings of the world. Now there's lots of controversy around this, but we'll just basically give you the rough ins and outs of where I think God was coming from. The Bible itself consists of 66 books, together forming a history book, the history of the universe, so to speak. It's a history written from God's point of view and God's perspective. So it's a history that's important to him. The events which affected him most deeply. Now there are huge chunks of time in between certain aspects of the Bible, and there are really short chunks of time in between other aspects. We jump from Adam and Eve and straight into Cain and Abel, which are their children, and then we jump to Noah and his great grandfather and his grandfather and his dad, and we are missing out a couple of generations in between them, and then we jump on to Abraham and what have you, and there are certain number of generations missing between Noah and Abraham, and it's building up a story, it's building up a picture of what families, what culture was important to God, and that's the thing that we have to realize and understand. It's just like with Noah, we sort of assume from the children's stories that Noah was came. Oh, I don't know what that was. Came straight after Cain and Abel, but he didn't. There were years and years in between. But there are two main themes in the Bible. The first one is what has gone wrong with our world, and the second one is how can it be put right. And we tend to come to the conclusion very quickly that only God can put it right, and he's going to do it by rescuing us from ourselves. And we quite quickly see that we're a people of folly, a people who say 1 minute we love God and the next minute we're turning our back on him and going off and doing other things. And that's basically the story of it. It's like a Greek tragedy, like a weird sort of love affair, the love affair that God has with mankind, and yet mankind is constantly turning his back on God and constantly running away and having dalliances or so to speak with other cultures' gods, and our God justifiably, I think, gets annoyed, and but he gets annoyed over time. It's not he gets annoyed straight away. He gets annoyed over time, and you can see his annoyance building and building until it gets to crescendo, and then we as a human race tend to say, oh, he's a bit annoyed. We'll turn back to him now and let his anger simmer down. But the book of Genesis introduces us to the stage, which is the creation of the world, the cast, which initially is Adam and Eve and then goes on to other people, and the plot of the great drama that we call redemption. The Hebrew title for this book was In the Beginning. Now the Hebrews tended to write things on scrolls, which were big long pieces of paper all rolled up, and the way that they knew what the books were titled was from the first couple of words. So the first couple of words of Genesis was in the beginning, so that became the title. When it was translated into Greek, about 250 years before Jesus was born, they changed the name to Genesis, which means origin. So effectively this is an origin story, sort of like the origin of Spider-Man or the origin of Batman or Superman. This is an origin story. So if you see it like that, you won't go far wrong. It's really the origin of all things, of animals, of our world, man, cities, murder, sin, death, war, conflict, and it deals with the ultimate questions like where did we come from, why are we here, and why does each of us have to die? Because we didn't have to die initially, and that's something that I'll come to when we do Adam and Eve. It's the foundational book of the Bible, and without Genesis putting in the foundations, it would have been a very strange book, and probably not the type of book that you'd actively go and read if it just started with the exodus of the children of Israel or something. It would then turn into a history book, and just a history of a people, whereas this is a history book, but the history of our world, and the history of a people the people of God, the people that God chose to specifically concentrate on, and it's telling their story. The whole of the Old Testament is built on the book of Genesis, with reference to Adam and Noah and Abraham and Jacob, who changed his name to Israel. It's like a sprouting tree that traces its roots back. We are in the outer branches of this tree. We are way up in the echelons of this tree. But if you trace the tree back down to its trunk, and then back down to its roots, right at the tip of its roots, you'd find this book, and that's very much how I see Genesis. Genesis is quoted more in the New Testament than in the Old Testament, and all the major writers of the New Testament, all 8 of them, all referred to the book of Genesis, as did Jesus. And Jesus took this book as a truth. So if I'm believing Jesus, which I do, then I'm believing that Genesis was the truth of this book. So let's get into it. This may last longer than 15 minutes because I've gone 10 minutes now just with the preamble. The beginning of the world. This takes up a massive section of the Bible. No, it doesn't. It takes up 1 and a bit chapters of the Bible. So that says a great deal about what God wanted to say with Genesis and with the beginning of the world. It basically says that God wasn't overly interested in the beginning of the world. He just put that in for effect. The first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. Now, you may think Moses was a sheep herder. Moses was a highly educated guy. He went to the top learning center in Egypt, for want of a better word, the University of Egypt, which, if you've ever been to London, the Cleopatra's Needle, the big obelisk that's on the bank of the River Thames, that was one of there were 2 of them. I think the other one's in France, and there were 2 of them placed at the entrance to this university. So Moses was highly educated. He had the best education in that you could have had, and he was taught to read and write, and that's where the basis for the Bible comes from. That's where the basis for Moses writing the first 5 books of the Bible came from. Now, he could go back to the beginnings by means of stories passed down by old storytellers and such like, but the first section, that first 1 and a bit chapters of the Bible, it was written completely differently to the rest of the first 5 books, which suggests that God effectively dictated it to him. So in that case, God wrote the beginning and the end of the Bible, because God dictated the book of Revelation to John. He dictated it in form of dreams, but it was dictated all the same. For a start, the first chapter and a bit of the Bible, the creation story, is it only uses 76 root words in Hebrew, and strangely, all 76 root words appear in every language on the earth. So this was made easy for everyone to understand, from the youngest to the oldest. This was put in a simplistic form, and yet there are more arguments about this first one and a bit chapters of the Bible than there are about most of the rest of the Bible put together. The easy analogy that I make for this is, and I pinched this one, is it's like building a house. If you were explaining to somebody, a youngster, how to build a house, you'd tell them simply that you are building a house. You tell them first you get the foundations in, and then you build the walls, then you put the windows in and the roof on top, and then you do the inside and the garden, and then you have a house. Plain and simple. But it's not actually that simple. In actual fact, you need a great deal more care than that. You need a lot more planning. Firstly, you need to draw up plans, then you have to get planning permission, you have to ascertain whether you've got the correct drainage available, and then arrange the contractors, and you arrange the carpenters, the builders, bricklayers, the plasterers, and you have to get them in at different times. You've got the plumbers in, and there's a whole remit of stuff that you need to do, and you have to do this all in certain timings. Like the carpenters would have to come back maybe 2 or 3 times because they have to do different aspects of the house. And God didn't want to go into that sort of detail. He wanted it to be understandable, and he wanted to explain how the world came to being, and he wanted to make it easy for us. So God basically explained it in an easy and understandable fashion, and we, being humans, being pedantic and being pernickety, we tend to analyze this 1 and a bit chapters to the nth degree, and we argue about whether it was actually 7 days, and the timings and all sorts of things. In all honesty, it doesn't overly matter. God's just giving us an idea where he started from, what he created, and then he's getting on to the thing that he finds most important, which is mankind, which is you and me. Because God's more interested in us than he is in what he had to do to get us here. That was a means to an end. And we are fixated on that section of things. But in reality, God is fixated on us. God is deeply in love with us. And we hurt him quite frequently. But he puts up with that. And he sort of said, yeah, I did all this stuff to create this land, and now we get into the good stuff. Now it's all about you. So out of 66 books, which is the entirety of the Bible, God has only deemed it necessary to use 1 and a bit chapters, and there weren't even chapter and verse when the Bible was written, and it seems a little bit odd to put the end of the story of creation into the second chapter, but whoever did it that way, and the chapters were put in a couple of hundred years before the verses were put in, but when this was written originally, it was written as a story, just as a story that you could read, and even in Jesus' day, there weren't chapters and verses. It was just a story which you could read. So, in essence, God just found it necessary to give us a basic, very basic grounding in what he had to do to get us to this place, to get human beings living on the earth. And we'll discover how that went when we do the next one of these, which is Adam and Eve, and that'll be in 3 days' time, and then we'll move on. Sometimes we'll take almost a book at a time. Sometimes we'll delve into stories, like delve into the stories in the Kings and Exodus and what have you. But when it comes to the likes of some other books, maybe we'll skip through those, and I'll just tell you the ins and outs and what have you with those books. But I hope you've enjoyed, and see you next time. Goodbye.